Hello, you lovely lot. It's time for a new episode of the podcast series, and this week it's with author Fiona Stanford.
I thought, this is really ironic. You know, on the one hand, you've got where we are mourning a death, and on the other hand, we've got the guardsmen out there who are. If it wasn't for the military and the army, we wouldn't have the tourists. We wouldn't have the freedom to come to London and see the sights. And one of those being obviously the guardsmen in their bear skins and tunics. And I wondered how many people actually realised that those men were fighting men. Did they realise that they actually do go out and onto the front line, as well as doing their ceremonial duties? And I felt so strongly that this was something that I needed to make clear. And I needed to wave the flag for those families who had lost their loved ones, so for the wounded and for the families in general.
I think it's safe to say that many of us have found ourselves a little bit in the shadows of our partners from time to time, especially if, like Fiona, you happen to be married to a 2-star general. In fact, everyone I told about interviewing Fiona instantly asked me what her husband did, rather than about her. So it gives me great pride to be able to focus on her story, which is just as fascinating. But just before we dive into the interview, I want to let you know about the sponsors for this series, the Royal British Legion. The Royal British Legion offers all members of our Armed Forces community support, but they also understand that sometimes what's needed is just a little bit of advice. Whether it's recommending specialised services, advice on housing, finances or employment, they've got your back. So make sure you head over to the Legion's website for more information. And now to the brilliant episode with Fiona Stanford. Fiona, thank you so much for joining me today. You kindly sent over a little bit of information about yourself before we started recording, and I'm really fascinated by you. I think it is brilliant, all the things you've done and all your experience, and I know that a lot of people listening will learn an awful lot from you. But before we get stuck in, please could you introduce yourself properly?
Well, hello, Jess, and thank you very much for having me on your show. My name is Fiona Stanford. And I think we both of us have to thank Helen Kendrick, actually, for putting us together. She was a guest on your last series, and she's the founder of Recruit for Spouses. So it's her that put us together, and I'm glad she did, because I'm really looking forward to it. So I've been part of the military lifestyle, the army lifestyle, now for the last 25 years, 25 last week, actually. We celebrated our silver wedding anniversary. And I am a nurse, a registered nurse. I'm also an author, and I've just become a student of homeopathy. So I have a few strings to my bow there.
So you mentioned you're a registered nurse, and I know that you've been, you said you've been married for 25 years, which from my experience of being married, for only 6 years, we've moved house an awful lot. But you are a registered nurse, and you have been through all that time. How has military life affected that, and how has it worked alongside it?
Nursing is obviously one of those careers that is extremely versatile, a bit like teaching. You can get a job as a nurse wherever you go. You know, everyone needs nurses. And even if it was just to join an agency or join the nursing bank of a hospital, you'd normally be able to find a job. I had a break from nursing for about 7 years when the children were very small. And therefore, if you don't nurse for 3 years and keep up your hours, you lose your registration. So I did lose my registration, but I did a return to practice course when we were based in Salisbury. And I did that course at Salisbury Hospital. As soon as I'd done the course, I thought to myself, oh, crikey, what have I done? Because how on earth am I going to do shifts when my husband's away so much, with the children being so little? I've completely, I'm barking up the wrong tree here. I need to do something completely different. But then I spoke to the recruitment office at the hospital, and I just said, look, I really need a job with school hours. I know everybody wants a job with school hours, but really that's all I can do, because I don't have family nearby. My husband's away, and I just simply can't do the shift work. So they said, okay, well, look, don't worry, we'll bear that in mind and we'll see what comes up. And then I was just really lucky because a job came up on the respiratory team. So I managed to do that job for 6 years at Salisbury. And within that time, I had 4 house moves. So I managed to commute. I think the longest commute was about an hour from Farnborough to Salisbury. And I then was able to, eventually I had to leave Salisbury because I couldn't make it work with the house moves. But we moved up to Innsworth in Gloucestershire. And I managed to use that respiratory qualification to take me into school nursing. Because if you think about it, school nurses, there's lots of asthma, there's lots of allergy. This school was a school called Rencombe College, which was near Cirencester, and they take children from the age of 4 to 18. So huge range. And it was the most amazing job I had. I kept that one down for 5 years. And during that time, we had 5 house moves. So for me, that job was my stability. And it was really, really important to me. And I was really sad when we left. But you have to move on. And we were moving on to Oman, which is where we are now. And that was a bit too far to commute. So I decided I couldn't keep that job going any longer. And now we're in Oman. I face the issue of keeping my registration going because, like I said earlier, if you don't work for 3 years, you lose it. And we are in Oman for 3 years, 3 months. The longest posting we have ever had. So I wondered how I was going to make this work for me. And although I could probably nurse out here, it would involve changing my visa. But the biggest barrier would be the language one. And although the hospital staff all speak English, the patients wouldn't necessarily. And I can't speak Arabic, at least not beyond a few words. So I decided that the only way I was going to get my hours was to volunteer. And I approached the Gurkha Welfare Trust. As some of you might know, a brigade of Gurkhas has been fighting alongside and latterly with the British Army for 200 years. It's an old regiment. And before the Gurkhas were eligible for pensions through the British Army, they used to go back home without any pension. And the Gurkha Welfare Trust has been set up to support the pensioners prior to the change of the payment scheme, and to give them medical advice and to help with their housing. After the earthquake in 2015, a lot of them lost their houses. And so I volunteered to go and do some nursing for the Gurkha Welfare Trust. And so they said, yes, please come out. We really need someone to educate the medics about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is really high incidence there because so much pollution in the cities, but also because they cook on open fires. And that's, they get respiratory problems. So I've been out there, I've traveled all around Nepal, and it's been just another avenue that opened up to me simply because we have this posting, and I had no idea before I came here that those sorts of opportunities would come up. So yes, you can use your nursing. You have to dig deep and you have to find other ways of doing it. But I've been lucky enough to find those ways of using my nursing wherever we've been.
Which is really interesting to talk to you about because I think it's all about adapting. I think for me particularly, the frequency of our house moves means that I'm having to reinvent myself every so often, which can really sort of crush you. And trying to get back out of that is a bit of a challenge. So you've mentioned that you have had 17 postings in 25 years. Now, I don't know if that includes house moves, but my goodness, that is an awful lot of postcodes to remember. I have done barely anything in comparison, and it's already driving me bonkers. But I'm just wondering how on earth you manage all those house moves, particularly when you have to give up things that you love. I think that's probably the interesting part, because I think that's probably the thing that we struggle with most.
Yes, and that has been 17 house moves, and not just the postings too. It is hard. People say to you, oh, well, you must be used to it by now. And you think, well, yeah, okay, I suppose I am used to it, but it doesn't mean to say, A, it gets any easier, or be, you really want to up sticks and move when you've just made a new friendship group and you've got your children sorted at school, and you've got to find a new doctor and a dentist and all of those administrative things. But I think you have to just embrace it, really. I mean, this is our lifestyle. I think when you get married into the military life, you don't just marry a husband, you actually marry, I married the army as well. And that does sound a bit corny, but it is like that because you are part of a big family. And, if you look at it like that you now belong to this big network, this big family, you get to know those people as if they are your family, and they will help you out, especially when times get tough. The others, they're always there for you, and you're always there for each other. So I think when you move, it is sad, and your children have to say goodbye to their friend, and so do you. But normally you start to bump into them. You think it's a coincidence at first, actually. You think, oh, that's funny. I bumped it, we met at such and such a place. And then after a few years, think, well, actually, we're just all going around in circles and we're overlapping like lots of little Venn diagrams everywhere. And so you kind of do expect to see people that you've met before. But I think if I was to give any advice about moving, and most people would work this one out for themselves, but for me, there are two main ingredients really to make a house into a home. And for me, those are rugs and pictures. And I have people come into a new quarter. We've just settled in, got everything sorted, and pictures up, rugs down, cushions and curtains. Those are the other things. But don't worry if you don't have your own curtains. I'm not very good at making curtains anyway, but you kind of accumulate them a little bit as you go along. As long as you've got your own personal stamp on it, you'll find people come in and they'll say, wow, this is just like your last home, but it's just in a different place. How do you do it? And I say, well, I just chuck a few rugs down and put some pictures up, and then that becomes me. So it's important to have your identity wherever you go, and to make that house into a home. I think with moving, that one of the hardest things, if you decide to keep your children at local schools, then it is very, very difficult to find. The schooling thing becomes one of the hardest things when you move house, because inevitably you're looking for a school before the summer holidays in order to secure a place. But often you don't actually know what your address is going to be come September. So you can't get a place at that school because you haven't got an address. And you certainly can't go out and buy a uniform if you haven't got, if that child hasn't got a place either. And you come to the point where you have to decide, when they're a bit older, whether you do the boarding school route or you use the local schools. And we ummed and ahed about this for a very long time. We fought it. Neither of us went to boarding school. It was an alien environment for both me and my husband, and we wanted the children to be with us. But in the end, we decided that actually it was the continuity that matters. And when we made that decision to put them both into boarding school at the same time, my daughter was 9, my son was 11. 9, I would never willingly have chosen to put my daughter into boarding school at 9. But if she hadn't gone then, she would have had another 2 schools in 3 years. So it just made sense. And it felt like the kindest thing to do for them, actually, oddly. And if you do decide to do that, then going back to your question, the moving does become easier, for sure, because you're not having to find a school every single time you move.
You are so right. I think from my experience, moving it's not the that gets easier, but you're right. You bump into people that you met 2 or 3 postings ago, and actually you do start to work out that you can make new friends and you can pick up the old ones. And actually it is quite enjoyable. I mean, it's very tough, but I think that's a really good point. That and the pictures. I'm a big fan of putting pictures up no matter how long I'm staying in a house, because you have to, because if you never put pictures up, you could spend, 25 years not feeling like you're really in a home. And I think that's really important. And I think that I'm definitely going to keep doing that. So thank you for sharing that. Now, although we tend to steer clear of the military on this podcast, we don't really try to talk about our partners' jobs, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the 1st Battalion, the Welsh Guards, and their 2009 tour of Afghanistan. During that tour, their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Thornlow, was killed, becoming the highest ranking officer to be killed in action since the Falklands. My husband was also deployed at that time, and I remember it really incredibly well. It was quite a challenging time, actually, for a lot of us. I was wondering if you could share your experience of that time.
Well, it was obviously a very difficult time for the military across the board. My husband was commanding officer of the Welsh Guards just before Rupert. He handed over to Rupert. In fact, he handed over prematurely, really, because my husband Richard was expecting to take the battalion to Afghanistan himself. He'd been involved in all of the run up to it and the exercises and the training, but he was promoted quite unexpectedly, which is a bit of a double-edged sword, because obviously that's a good thing. But he actually had really wanted to take the battalion to Afghanistan, but he couldn't because the timings weren't right. It was several months before the battalion went away still, and they couldn't hold the new job open long enough. So he handed over to Rupert. And we were therefore stationed near Aldershot anyway, or in Aldershot with the battalion. And so I was still there with all the families, because Richard actually was posted to Iraq instead, where he was supposed to go for 11 months. And in fact, in the end, he went for 9 months because they were pulled out of Iraq just a bit earlier than that. So although Richard was also away at the same time as the battalion was away in Afghanistan, for me, it was all relative. Iraq was still a dangerous place to be, but it wasn't quite as volatile as Afghanistan was at that time. So I was part of the regiment, but I wasn't. My husband was doing a different thing, but I was still there with the family. So it was a slightly odd situation for me. But I think it helped me to be able to stand back a little bit and just to see how the families were coping. It was a really, really tough time. The battalion lost 7 men. Rupert was one of those. And Rupert's wife, Sally, was and still is a friend of mine. And, it's when you are personally involved, on that level, it can be really difficult to be able to sort of stand back and see any sort of way through. So yes, it was hard. It was hard for everybody. Yeah.
And that terrible time and that experience, it encouraged you to write your book, Don't Say Goodbye, Our Heroes and the Families They Leave Behind, which you describe as a memorial to show the human face of the support behind the scenes. And how was it? So you talked to a lot of people who had gone through so much. How was it talking to them?
Well, I never had the idea to write a book. I always loved writing, actually, and I'd done creative writing courses and things like that. But writing a book was something that was, maybe I would do on retirement, like a lot of people think they will. And it was when I was at Rupert's funeral in the Guards Chapel in London, and I had this moment where I just suddenly thought, you know what, I really feel that there is a need to write about this whole lifestyle. There was a lot of public support out there at the time, and it was big. Obviously, I mean, the conflict was in the news every single day. Nobody could avoid the news, even if they'd wanted to. But I remember looking across from the Guards Chapel, which is in Birdcage Walk. You can see Buckingham Palace. You can see the guardsmen guarding Buckingham Palace. And I just thought, this is really bizarre. Here we are. We have Rupert, a guardsman. We're at his funeral, and just over the road there are guardsmen who are guarding the palace. And there were hundreds, if not thousands, of tourists outside the gates, as there always are in the summer, because it was in the middle of July. And I thought, this is really ironic. On the one hand, you've got where we are mourning a death, and on the other hand, we've got the guardsmen out there who are. If it wasn't for the military and the army, we wouldn't have the tourists. We wouldn't have the freedom to come to London and see the sights. And one of those being obviously the guardsmen in their bear skins and tunics. And I wondered how many people actually realised that those men were fighting men. Did they realise that they actually do go out and onto the front line, as well as doing their ceremonial duties? And I felt so strongly that this was something that I needed to make clear. And I needed to wave the flag for those families who had lost their loved ones, so for the wounded and for the families in general. So I started asking people what they felt, and it was quite humbling, actually. And I felt like it was a huge responsibility to get it right. Sally was one of the first ones I spoke to, and she said, "No, I want to tell this story. I want Rupert to have a legacy, and I feel that we owe it to the families as well to do that." So I started asking her and some of the other families, the mothers who'd lost their sons, the wives who'd lost their husbands, the girlfriends who'd lost their boyfriends. They just couldn't stop talking. It was a really cathartic experience for them, and an opportunity for them not only to pour out their grief, but to leave a story behind for their loved ones. So they're represented in the book. The wounded and their partners are represented. The children have stories to tell about moving around and about military life. And then also the men themselves. I say men, but because in the infantry, of course, it's the men who are on the front line. I am aware that obviously there are women serving as well, but there are men and women who give their stories about how they feel that bringing their partners into this lifestyle feels for them. They feel very responsible, actually. I feel very strongly that there should never be any blame. It's a team thing, that we go into this together. If you're married, you're together. You shouldn't it's really easy when times are hard to start blaming. And I've done it myself. You blame your husband. If it wasn't for him, you wouldn't be doing this anyway. You blame the system, because if it wasn't for them, you wouldn't be moving around every 2 years or more. But there comes a time when you just have to stop being that victim, and you have to embrace it and be a team, get back together as a team, because it can be so destructive if you start to get too critical. But going back to the book, it is quite a bittersweet account, because it's about the whole of the military lifestyle. It's centered on the conflict in Afghanistan and on those men who were killed, but it is about the whole lifestyle. And so therefore it is a book for the military, not just for the Welsh Guards, not just for the army. It belongs to all of us, actually. It's not my book, it's our book, because it tells our story. My story is not unique. It's so many people could read it and say, yeah, I get that. That's just the same as, I've had that experience. So it was a very interesting experience for me. And as I say, it was very humble, and I feel very honoured to have had the chance to write it.
And is there anybody that you spoke to, or is there any sort of theme running through the book that really stands out that you think is at the heart of it? I mean, you said how we're all sort of, your story isn't unique, and we all sort of live this kind of crazy military life that is very similar. But is there anything that particularly stood out from that?
I think the theme that ran through the whole book was love, actually. Love and support. We do these crazy things because we love our husbands or our wives, and you people in all walks of life will find themselves doing things that they never thought they'd do, simply because they found themselves in those situations. And the theme of love and support comes through with the camaraderie, not just amongst the men. It tends to be a word that's used for men bonding in times of war, but actually it can be applied to the families back home. It is when times are hard and you find yourself on your own. You never really are on your own. There's always somebody else in that position. And the bonds that were formed during that time were huge, and they'll never be broken. Even if your friends leave the army military system, you'll always have them. You'll always have them as friends. And if you go through an experience with somebody, I think that's something that will always gel a relationship, and that's something you can't break. It sounds like a very sort of depressing book, but actually it does have it's quite bittersweet. And there are some stories in there as well about the peculiarities of the household division, because obviously with their ceremonial duties, they've done all sorts of things. And there's one story about one of the officers who was in charge of the pallbearers at the Princess of Wales's funeral. And he writes this account of how absolutely terrifying it was to carry this coffin up the aisle at Westminster Abbey, which is the longest aisle, I think, ever. And they had hobnail boots. And he was terrified of one of them slipping with this lead-lined coffin. And although it was a very somber occasion, it was an angle to that occasion that I don't suppose anyone had ever thought about. But he tells it so well. And so there's little anecdotes like that, which are kind of off the track of the book, but they're still part of it, a part of our life, and they're part of who we are. And lovely little stories of one girl who got married, and she was married to one of the Welsh guards, and they knelt at the altar, and someone had done that old one. they'd written HE on one of his boots and LP on the other boot, so that the congregation just burst out laughing as soon as they knelt to say their vows. So there's lots of little things. So hopefully there's a good balance in the book as well.
And it's those little anecdotes that sort of make military life what it is, isn't it? It's the little sort of the serious that's balanced with the banter and the giggles, which I think is the strength of it. It's good fun. It really is. So you've written a book, which is an epic thing. And I know a lot of people talk about writing books, but you have done it. How do you write a book? And you've mentioned recently that you've written another one. I mean, is it very strict? Do you have to sit down and research, or do you just go for it? It'd be really interesting to find out how you did it.
Well, it's quite a big question, and I will try and précis it. But I think bottom line, it depends on your why. Why are you writing? Why do you want to write? If you want to write because you just simply love it, and you just want to write whatever comes into your head, then that's great. I mean, that's a brilliant way to pass your time more than anything. But if you want to write a book because you want to get a message across, and you want it to be published, then you've got to do a little bit of homework on that. You've got to know who your audience is. You've got to know who you're writing it for, what age group you're writing it for. Writing non-fiction, which is what my book Don't Say Goodbye was, in some ways the process is, I think, probably easier, because what you have to do is, if you do this the traditional way and you're not self-publishing, you approach an agent with your proposal. So you give them your first 3 chapters, your introduction, and you say the rest of the book is going to be based along these lines, but you don't have to write the whole book up front. So you approach an agent with your proposal, and then they say yes or no, I like this, I'm going to put it to a publisher, and we'll see if the publisher will take it on. It saves you a lot of time, I think, if you do nonfiction in many ways, although it can take a long time to find an agent and find a publisher. The other thing was, with my first book, I also wanted to help the Welsh Guards charity. So it was a fundraiser as well, which was one of my reasons too. And the profits went towards the Welsh Guards charity, and it was there to support the Welsh Guards who had been wounded and their families who lost their loved ones. And it's still going strong. It's actually it now pays to employ veterans officer, which is the first time I've ever done that. So somebody to actually take care of those veterans once they've left the army. So, there's it does depend on your reasons for wanting to write, but don't be disheartened if you come up against a lot of brick walls, because publishing is a hard place to get into, especially now with people self-publishing and so on. Self-publishing is also, I've never done it, but I wouldn't do it personally, because I've seen how much goes into producing a book. There are so many different aspects to it. And if you want to produce a book that looks professional, you will end up spending an awful lot of money paying people to make it look professional, and time spent where you could be writing. Whereas if you go the traditional route, then they pay you up front, and you don't have to worry about all what the book cover looks like, what the publicity is going to be, about the editing, the proofreading. That's all taken out of your hands. And so there are two very different angles to approach publishing a book.
Yes, and I used to, back in my life before the RAF, so I used to work in publishing and used to work at Oxford University Press, which is very exciting. But there are proper traditional publishers where if you are an author who has self-published, that's counted as a negative towards you, and they probably won't publish you, no matter how amazing your book is. So I would maybe suggest thinking really hard, if you are writing a book, thinking about it properly and working out whether you can go down the traditional route as opposed to the self-published route, because that can cause you problems longer down the line. So now, you have been married since 1995, and I'm curious to know about your military life and how, as a wife, it has changed over those 25 years, because obviously life has changed. The views towards women have changed, and I'm wondering how it has changed since 1995, and whether there's anything in our community that has been lost that actually we should get back, because it's quite important.
I think it has changed. It has changed. What doesn't change in 25 years, especially nowadays, with communications and so on. I think I joined the system, if you like, when it was on the cusp of a big change. If I was to talk to somebody when I first got married who had been in for 25 years, their story would be very different. It was really, really unusual for wives to work for a start when they joined the military a generation before me. I think partly because there was so much moving around. Okay, we've had lots of postings, but there were an awful lot more overseas postings in those days. And it was well nigh impossible to get a job unless you were very lucky and once you'd got to these far-flung places. But it wasn't expected of the wives to work. And so they didn't fight it. Even if they'd had jobs beforehand, that was just what they did. They just gave them up. When I got married, that was changing. There were more professionals. There were women who'd had jobs like lawyers, people who actually had clients and needed to stay in one place because they couldn't really make it work otherwise. And so that was becoming more and more evident shortly after I got married. I think that makes it harder. I think it's good. It's very good for our mental well-being to sort of have a career and pursue something that was your identity, really. But I think it can make it harder sometimes. I mean, it's great if you can make it work. And that's what we want to try and help people to do, if possible. But I think when a woman has a career, or the spouse has a career that requires them to be in one place, and therefore you do that, what you're doing is you're adding on more separations on top of those separations that are going to be forced on you anyway. So you end up spending even longer apart from your spouse than you might have to. Having said that, I wonder after the COVID lockdown whether this will all start to change anyway, because I think if businesses and so on are realizing how much they can do from home or remotely, then maybe that will help, and maybe people will be able to do more from a distance without having to go into an office and so on. But I would strongly support anybody who would try and maintain their career, or even find a different one, the one that works for their lifestyle, even if it wasn't what they trained in. It would be something that's we should encourage and support people to do. But yeah, things have changed, some for the better and some not, as you would expect in that length of time.
And do you think there's anything that we have lost that we need to reinvigorate and get going again? Because I know there's a lot of talk, welfare always asking us what we would like, and none of us are really quite sure what it is that we actually want. I just feel that there's a lost opportunity here to learn from what has happened before, and whether we can start re-injecting some of that sort of community again back into the life that we lead.
I believe that the military is trying to get people to stay in one place for longer. They're trying not to. It's an expensive thing to move people around every couple of years, as much as anything. And obviously, saving money has become more vital, and will become more so now. So I think to be able to stay in one place is going to get easier, and maybe that community side of things will get easier as a result. The only downside of staying in one place longer is that's fine if it's somewhere you want to be. But if it's not, then it's pretty rubbish, really. I mean, we all learn to take the good with the bad, and some of the postings have been pretty awful, and you'd rather they didn't have to go to certain places, and others have been fantastic and you don't want to leave. So I think at least when you're moving around, you can see light at the end of the tunnel. If it's one that you didn't really, you're not really enjoying, well, it was not for very long, and the next one will probably be better. But your question about sense of community, I think no matter what happens, that sense of community within the military system will always be very strong. Somebody said to me once, and I'd never thought of it like this before. She said, "I feel that with you army lot, that I feel like you're it's almost like you belong to an elite sort of club where nobody else is allowed in from the outside." And that really shocked me, because I thought, crikey, I would never want somebody to feel that they were excluded in any way. And it's a really difficult one, because unless you're living it, you can't really understand it. And yet we want people to understand it. So we can't have it, we can't have a cake and eat it. And I think the only way around that is for us to work hard at keeping our old friendships, the ones that we had before our lives changed. And that might require a bit more effort on our part, because actually when you're the one who's moving around all the time, people are going to wait for you to come to them whenever you happen to be within striking distance at a new posting. But I do think you have to work very hard sometimes to keep your ties, because there will come a time when you won't be in the military, and although you will still keep those friends, they'll all go to different parts of the country. They all come from different areas. And if you try and keep hold of your old friends as well, then you've still got them when you get out, and they've still got you, because they feel, I'm sure, that that they've lost you to the system. Sometimes if you suddenly just go into a different world that they don't understand, And then, then that's when the friendships just break down and drift away.
Yeah.
So there's two sorts of communities, your old one and your new one.
And you're right, you could nurture them both, because it's kind of that unspoken thing that we have in the military community where we just get it. We understand each other without having to explain it. And my sort of civilian friends, even though I am a civilian myself, but my civilian friends, they don't, it's hard to explain it. So I think that's why sometimes along the way they get lost. But I think that is very important. And I'm going to take that away and I'm going to nurture my old friends a bit more, I think. So what would you say to somebody who is just getting married and they're facing 25 years of, or even more, I think, actually, of military life, of military service? What would you say to them? What is your best sort of tip?
I would say enjoy it. And just enjoy the moment. Don't look too far ahead. There's always a danger when you start on a posting that is going to be, let's say, 2 years. Sometimes it's much less than that, but let's call it 2 years. Those first 6 months you're settling in, you're getting to know new friends, the children, if you've got children, settling into new school. So it's all busy. And then you've got a period of time, probably a good year before you have to start thinking about moving again. Sometimes you get notice of moving. You get a lot of notice. I don't think that's a good thing. I think if you know where you're going next, you start to think about that next place far too soon. If you don't know where you're going next, let's say you get 6 months notice, then just enjoy that time in the middle, that year in the middle where you've spent your 6 months settling in and you've got 6 months before you move. Just without worrying or wondering what the next thing's going to be, because they go so quickly. These postings just whiz by. And if you're always either looking back over your shoulder and thinking that the last one was better, or looking forward and thinking, I wonder what that's going to be, you're just never going to enjoy the one that you're in. So I would say that just enjoy it. Have fun. There will be good times, there will be bad times, but there will be an end to those bad times. So just make sure that you look after your friends and your family and support each other, and take things up, do things you didn't do before. We've all moved into quarters where the garden is shocking and all it is a piece of grass and no one's bothered. They haven't even planted any spring bulbs. And we've moved into ones where someone has made an effort. And, in the spring comes around, I think, oh, wow, I never realized those flowers were there. You can be the one to surprise the next person. Take care of it so that, you leave a nice garden for somebody, and then therefore you might inherit a nice garden off somebody else. Do little things like that. Get involved in not only the military community, but the outside community with your friend, your children's friends' parents. Do something that doesn't just pigeonhole you into that one environment that you find yourself in. And all sorts of things. Take up new things. Take up yoga. Do some online courses. There's so many things that you can do, that you can get to a new place and think, right, what can this offer me? And you'll find it. You will find it.
There is.
So I think, there's a few things there.
And I think the gardening thing has really struck a chord, because lockdown here started 18th-ish of March, just as we were coming into spring. And gosh, it was a sad time. But at that point, it was when all the daffodils and the tulips and all those beautiful bulbs that somebody, many years ago might have planted, that suddenly bring that bit of colour after a really sad winter, falling into a global pandemic. And I loved the fact that a couple of years ago somebody made the effort to do that, and now at this horrendous time I get to enjoy these flowers. And I think that we need to start a campaign to do bulbs. Everybody needs to start planting bulbs, because it's just lovely that somebody a few years ago cared enough. So that's really struck a chord. So that's one of the things I think I'm going to do, despite the fact that I move house every 10 minutes. I think I'm going to start working out how to plant bulbs and do that, because I just think it's lovely.
There was a lady, we lived near Salisbury. We lived near Salisbury several times. But there was a lady opposite, and she was the vicar. Well, the vicar's wife. The vicar lived opposite us, actually, because we weren't on a patch at this point. And Richard went away. I can't remember where. I think it was Iraq, let's say, for 6 months. And she came round. I opened the door one day and she was standing there with her husband, and they had one of these bulb planters in their hand. And they said, right, we thought we would help you and the children plant some bulbs. Because if we do that now, because he was due to come back in about March. And so if you do that now, then you'll be able to see them come through. And you all know that by the time that they come into flower, then he'll be back home. And I just thought, what a lovely thing to do. That was so kind and thoughtful. And she was absolutely right. You know, as soon as those bulbs started to peep through, it just felt like he was almost home. And the children loved it. You know, they were waiting for them to come through. And you know, I just thought, I just love that. The planting of the bulbs thing, I think is really lovely. When you're not in a place for very long.
Yeah, I think we all need to do it. We need to work out how to do it, and we need to do some bulbs. We can do the whole thing around it and encourage people to do it. And maybe one day I'll end up in a lovely house with lovely bulbs and a lovely garden. I'm quite excited about that. So we're sort of reaching the end, but I want to go back to your book because I think that it's quite important that you share it so that we can all read it. So where can we find your book?
You can find it on Amazon, not surprisingly. You can also find it in bookshops, even if usually the Waterstones will have it. It depends on how big the Waterstones is. But if you, even if it's a small bookshop, you can always order it, and they'll always be able to order it in. But you can get it in. It came out in hardback first, and then it went into paperback, and it's also on Kindle, so you can get all three.
Fab, and I will share the link as well so we can all buy it. So this is sort of the end, and I have loved talking to you and gaining from your experience and feeling sort of happy that some of the things that I'm doing is working and making a difference. But I was just wondering if there's anything you'd like to add before we finish.
I would say you talked about you know, we were touched slightly on challenges, setting yourself challenges. And I think that's an important thing with postings. It defines that posting. You can say, oh, when I was in such and such, you know, I did this, or I learned how to do that. I think that's an important thing to do. I listened to one of your guests on one of your previous episodes, Jodie Jones, who's from the channel, and I thought it kind of put my little challenge into perspective, because last year I did this mad open water swim in Oman from an island to the mainland, and the island is called Fahal Island, which actually means shark in Arabic. I didn't know that. I didn't realise there were sharks. Anyway, so I did this swim, which was 4 kilometres, and for me, it was, I mean, I won't do it again. It was tough. It was really tough. And I had trained very hard for it. But I have to say, you know, it is all relative. I mean, and when I listened to your podcast with Jodie, I thought, crikey, you know, it's that swim I did was a walk in the park in comparison. But it's all personal to you, and you know, every challenge is personal to the person who's doing it, and whatever it is, as long as you feel that you've got something out of it, I think then it doesn't matter what it is. Just go for it, and I'm sure you'll feel better for it.
Yes, because military life is tough, so you might as well have the good bits. I think that's probably the most important thing, isn't it?
Yeah, the most important thing is to have fun and enjoy.
Fiona, I've loved talking to you. I've learned so much. It's been really enjoyable. So thank you again for spending time and talking to me all the way from Oman.
You're very welcome. You're welcome. It's lovely speaking to you and getting to know you.
another thank you to lovely Fiona. I really enjoyed talking to her. I think that's a brilliant episode and we can all take an awful lot from it. So a massive thank you, and do go and check out her book over on Amazon or in your local bookstores. So that is it for today, but I will of course be back next week with yet another inspiring episode. So I shall see you then.